Nicolò Rizzuto, born in Cattolica Eraclea, Sicily, initially served as an underling in the Cotroni crime family under the influential Vincenzo Cotroni. Working alongside notable figures like Luigi Greco, a prominent lieutenant within the Cotroni family, Nicolo displayed unwavering loyalty and a deep understanding of the criminal underworld. Eventually, Nicolo would establish his own formidable dynasty, leading the Rizzuto crime family and leaving an enduring impact on the criminal landscape of Montreal. Renowned for his strategic brilliance and unwavering determination, Nicolo's story is one of loyalty, ambition, and an unrelenting pursuit of power within the Canadian criminal underworld. Nicolò Rizzuto was born on February 18, 1924, in Cattolica Eraclea, where he would also meet and later marry Libertina Munno. His father, Vito, then emigrated illegally to the United States with his brother-in-law Calogero Renda. He was murdered on August 12, 1933, in a quarry in Paterson, New York. In 1945, when Rizzuto got married, he was arrested for the first time as he was preparing to sell 350 kilograms of contraband wheat on the black market. The same year, his mother, Maria, was also arrested for selling illicit wheat, a crime of which her own father had been convicted as well. It was also in Cattolica Eraclea where the couple would have their first son, born on February 21, 1946. They would name him Victor, also known as Vito, in honor of Rizzuto's father, Victor Rizzuto. 15 months later, the couple would have a daughter named Maria, in honor of Rizzuto's mother. Libertina Munno was the daughter of Antonio Munno, born in 1904 and the head of a tight-knit family known in the Italian police files as the Famiglia Munno. The Munnos were the preeminent mafia clan of the territory to the west of the city of Agrigento. Antonio Munno was the uncontested capo mafia of Cattolica Eraclea and its neighboring rural catchments inside Agrigento province at the height of his dominance. By marrying Libertina, Rizzuto had already taken a step up into the world of organized crime. On February 21, 1954, the 8th birthday of their son Vito, they disembarked the transatlantic passenger ship, the MS Vulcania, and headed to one of central Canada's largest cities, Montreal. In Montreal, Rizzuto already had at least one friend, Giuseppe Cuffaro, who settled in the city on August 10, 1953, 6 months before the Rizzuto family arrived in Canada, according to Canadian immigration records. Cuffaro, the future Caruana-Contrera clan's chief money launderer, was from Montalegro, another Agrigento village in the Famiglia Munno's mafia triangle. Cuffaro and Rizzuto would become friends as well as partners. Nicolò Rizzuto started to be known almost exclusively by his obvious anglicization name as Nick. In 1934, 20 years prior to the Rizzuto's arrival, the Cotroni family of Mammala, Calabria, had immigrated to Montreal, Canada. Vincenzo Cotroni, typically called Vic or Vincent, had started establishing himself bootlegging alcohol together with his father Nicodemo Cotroni. Vic had developed as a significant force in Montreal by 1945, with his hands in everything from theft and extortion to organizing votes and terrorizing polling stations during elections. His two brothers, Giuseppe known as Pep and Francesco known as Frank, would become progressively involved in the drug trade. However, Vic's endeavors would not go unnoticed by Joseph Bonanno, the founding head of the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 families that had formed as a powerful and controlling criminal elite in New York City. Carmine Lillo Galante, Joseph Bonanno's underboss, was sent to Montreal to create a tight working relationship with elements of organized crime already functioning in Canada. When Lillo crossed the border into Canada for business in Montreal, he established a relationship with Luigi Greco, a former bodyguard for Harry Davis, a major drugs trafficker in Montreal during the 1940s until his death in 1946. Joe Bonanno's mandate for Lillo was to bring illegal gambling in Montreal under control. However, not long after this achievement, he was more set on trafficking heroin. With so much heroin passing through his Canadian base, Galante felt he had found a better home. Through Greco, who joined with Vic Cotroni after the death of Harry Davis, Galante established a healthy relationship with Vic, which later resulted in Galante becoming a godparent to one of Vic's children, and Vic a godparent to one of Galante's. In the late 1950s, Galante had established a Bonanno family decina and made the Calabrian Vic Cotroni and the Sicilian Luigi Greco his chief lieutenants. It said that in 1955, Galante was deported after failing to answer authorities on what exactly he did for a living, after which he then sent his brother-in-law Anthony Morelli to oversee and handle business. However, according to FBI reports, Morelli, Galante, and his bodyguard, Michael Consolo, were deported from Canada on April 30, 1956. Joe Bonanno then sent Salvatore Little Sal Giglio as his Montreal agent. However, he too was deported after police found 240 illegal Cuban cigars and 880 American cigarettes in his possession. Bonanno then appointed Vic Cotroni as his new Montreal agent. Vic Cotroni was put in a bind in 1964 when his boss, Joseph Bonanno, in 1963, allegedly issued contracts on rival bosses Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, Stefano Magaddino, and Frank De Simone. His operation was foiled, however, when Joseph Colombo, who had received the contract from Bonanno associate Joseph Magliacco, betrayed the plan to the intended targets. The commission summoned Bonanno and Magliacco to explain themselves, but Bonanno fled to Montreal in mid-1964. Vic was then put in a difficult position since he wanted to please both his boss and the commission. Vic was put under even more strain when Stefano Magaddino interpreted Bonanno's presence in Montreal as a sign of an intention to move into his area of southern Ontario, prompting the Buffalo crime boss to threaten Vic that he should dissociate himself from Bonanno if he wanted to live. However, Bonanno was deported from Canada in the summer of 1964. But more heat soon came with the arrival of Joe Bonanno's son, Salvatore Bonanno, and others on November 28, 1966. However, when Montreal police pulled over the younger Bonanno's automobile, they discovered 3 loaded handguns, prompting him and the rest of his party to be deported to the United States. Magaddino became enraged when he learned of the planned Bonanno-Cotroni meeting and summoned Vic to a meeting in Buffalo, which Vic declined, further infuriating Magaddino. Giacomo Lupino of Hamilton, one of Magaddino's few friends he respected, tried to talk the Buffalo boss out of killing Vic. In a successful attempt to play the mediator, Lupino arranged for his son-in-law, Paolo Violi, who had already gone to Montreal in 1963, to be a Cotroni family underboss in exchange for Magaddino canceling his plans to kill Vic, who would continue to work for Bonanno. Lupino, the leader of the 'Ndrangheta in Hamilton, took Violi under his wing because he was an old friend of Violi's father, Domenico, who had come to the United States and settled in Parma, near Cleveland. This was Lupino's way of making sure Violi was safe should any war wage between Magaddino and the Cotronis. Magaddino, on the other hand, saw Violi as his beachhead in Montreal, who would eventually allow him to annex Quebec to his Canadian territories, weakening his rivals, the Bonanno family. In Quebec, Violi opened the Reggio Bar in St. Leonard in the mid-1960s, which he used as a base for extortion. In December 1970, his office was bugged by undercover cop Robert Menard, who recorded everything Violi said in the Reggio Bar for the next 5 years. In the 1960s, Nick Rizzuto founded a company with his brother-in-law Domenico Munno, Grand Royal Asphalt Paving. He joined the Sicilian Association of Montreal, an organization whose members included heroin traffickers. Nick allegedly connected with the Cotroni crew through Greco shortly after his arrival in Montreal and swiftly rose to prominence, but his continual gripes about having to take instructions from a Calabrian in the Cosa Nostra created considerable consternation. To make matters worse, Violi, a Calabrian, had climbed fast through the Cotroni ranks, even surpassing Greco and Vic's own brother, Frank, and by the early 1970s, Vic Cotroni chose Violi as his successor. Violi periodically complained about the Bonannos, and he encouraged Cotroni to break free from them and become more than the Bonannos' northern franchise. That irritated Nick and Greco, who remained fiercely loyal to the Bonannos despite the fact that they had passed Greco up for the position of boss of Montreal. A meeting was called in December 1971 at a cottage outside the village of Lepafani to discuss tensions between the Sicilian and Calabrian groups, with Violi representing the Calabrian faction and Leonardo Caruana, Giuseppe Cuffaro, and Pietro Sierra representing the Sicilian faction. On September 15, 1972, police wiretaps overheard Cotroni saying that Nick Rizzuto should be kicked out of the family. However, major decisions like these still required permission from New York. The Bonanno family's boss, Natale Joe Diamond Evola, dispatched New Yorkers Nicky Alfano and Nicola Buttafuoco to Montreal in an attempt to resolve the conflict. Vic Cotroni and Paolo Violi discussed getting rid of Nick Rizzuto, and when they asked for permission, it was denied. Luigi Greco, Vic's longtime associate, died unexpectedly on December 7, 1972, while working on the floor of his pizzeria when solvent caught fire and burned him to death. Nick Rizzuto refused to pay tribute to Violi and refused to talk with him, turning down many face-to-face meetings in obvious contempt of his new Calabrian boss. Before Nick was summoned for a crime probe against organized crime, he fled to Venezuela, which had no extradition treaty with Canada. Nick appointed his son Vito to handle operations in Montreal, and in Venezuela, Nick formed an alliance with the Corsican gangsters of French organized crime to continue the French Connection heroin smuggling network via South America, where he would also be seen meeting a bodyguard of the Vancouver mobster, Paul Volpe. Later, Nick became a Venezuelan citizen, and in Caracas, he controlled interests in the construction industry and ran a nightclub called Il Padrone. In 1976, Bob Menard's recordings were played in public at the SICO hearings, which would ultimately set the fate of Paolo Violi. The recordings showed that Violi had not fulfilled the traditional mafia standards of leadership. He was braggart and indiscreet. This enraged the Sicilian flank of the Cotroni organization and also made the Calabrese vulnerable to attack. On February 14, 1976, Pietro Sierra, Violi's advisor, and his wife were at the theater watching The Godfather Part 2. As they left arm in arm, he was shot down by a man in a hood with a 12-gauge shotgun. On February 8, 1977, Violi's brother Francesco was shot and killed in his office at Violi Importing and Distributing. At the time, Paolo Violi was in jail serving contempt charges. On January 28, 1978, Paolo Violi was invited to play cards when two armed men wearing ski masks entered the club they were in. They commanded everyone on the floor, except Violi, when one of the men put a sawed-off shotgun to the back of Violi's head and fired. He was killed instantly, but received another blast to the top of his head. There was a rumor that Vic Cotroni gave the order or even that he gave his approval. However, any hit on Violi had to be sanctioned from New York. Vic attended Violi's funeral, but did not sit with the family. Although Nick was in Venezuela when Violi was murdered, he was linked to the murder of Violi, but his brother-in-law Domenico Munno pled guilty. Domenico Munno was sentenced along with Giovanni de Mora to 7 years, as well as Nick's confidant, Agostino Contrera, who was sentenced to 5 years. The three were allowed to plead guilty to plotting the murder, rather than executing the murder. After the early 1980s, the Calabrian group continued to function with Frank Cotroni, who had been imprisoned from 1975 to 1979, acting as acting boss for his ailing brother Vincenzo. Frank took over as boss after Vic Cotroni died of cancer in 1984. In the 1980s, Nick Rizzuto returned to Canada and kept a low profile. The Cattolica Mafia clan was closely associated with Nick, and its operations extended far beyond Montreal, with the clan involved in the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, Switzerland, and Venezuela. In December 1988, a police officer stated, "Frank Cotroni's probably finished. Right now, Nicolò Rizzuto has the power."